Mussolini tried to warn us, and we ignored it. What happens when a nation, broken by war and starved for identity, mistakes a showman for a savior? He was a man who thrived on spectacle, not just a politician, but a performer. Benito Mussolini saw politics not as a duty to the people, but as theatre for the masses. He crafted his image like an emperor reborn, reveling in the thunder of crowds chanting his name, saluting as if their very lives depended on it. Mussolini was more than a leader, he was a symbol. The self-proclaimed Duce, the architect of fascism, the man whose likeness didn't just stand in stone and bronze, but haunted the very soul of post-war Italy. His shadow stretched across piazzas, newspapers, classrooms, and most dangerously, minds. He strutted on the balconies like a modern Caesar, roaring from podiums with promises of a resurrected Roman glory. But behind the marches and military parades, behind the propaganda films and the sculpted slogans, something far darker was taking root. A system built on fear. A regime fueled by violence. A nation seduced into surrendering its freedom, one ovation at a time. This wasn't just Italy's story. It was a warning to the world. But if we strip away the bravado, the propaganda, and the carefully crafted myths, we find not just the story of a dictator, but a set of warnings. Warnings about how democracy withers when no one will defend it, how truth crumbles when it is inconvenient, and how easy it is for a society, any society, to surrender its freedom for the illusion of strength. Mussolini didn't set out to warn the future, but his life is a cautionary tale that echoes through modern times, pounding with the steady, ominous rhythm of history, not repeating, but rhyming. Italy in 1919 was a nation in agony. The First World War had left its fields blood-soaked, its treasury empty, and its people divided. Promised territorial gains by the Allies had failed to materialize, and post-war treaties felt like a betrayal. There was runaway inflation, food shortages, unemployment. The country teetered on the edge of chaos. Strikes and protests swept through the cities. Radicals and reactionaries fought in the streets. The old ruling classes were despised, and the parliamentary system appeared hopelessly weak, unable to answer the moment's desperation. From this confusion emerged Benito Mussolini, who had once agitated for socialism, but now saw his opportunity in something more potent, the promise of national rebirth. He formed a seductive, the Fasci di Combattimento, a band of black-shirted veterans, angry youths and opportunists, fueled by violence, nostalgia, and fear. Their enemies were socialism, liberalism, and anyone who questioned the sacrosanct unity of Italy. But their true weapon was not ideology but spectacle, dramatic, fiery gestures directed at a public hungry for certainty. And yet Mussolini didn't seize power with a coup. In October 1922, he led the March on Rome, a mass demonstration more symbolic than strategic. The king, fearing civil war and chaos, invited Mussolini to form a government. It was a transfer of power not at the tip of a bayonet, but by the trembling hand of a constitutional monarch. This was the first warning. Democratic systems don't always fall by force. Sometimes they bleed out by apathy, by the well-intentioned or overly cautious giving way to the expedient. Once established as Prime Minister, Mussolini didn't outright destroy Italy's democracy overnight. He chipped away at it, exploiting its weaknesses, turning its safeguards into weapons. Every change, a press law here, an electoral tweak there, was technically legal. The parliament was not dissolved, but packed with loyalists. Opponents were not always shot or sent to remote islands, but blacklisted, harassed, silenced. Mussolini harnessed the machinery of modern media, newspapers, film, radio, to craft an image of himself as Italy incarnate. He was the duce, the leader, the irreplaceable savior. Critics weren't merely wrong, they were traitors. Intellectuals were cowed into compliance or forced into exile. Debates narrowed to slogans. Facts gave way to narratives. The entire nation was compelled to perform unity, drowning out dissent with manufactured cheers and staged rallies. This is the second warning. Tyranny doesn't always storm through the gates waving a banner of violence. More often, it slips in quietly, cloaked in the language of law, order, and national revival. It doesn't shatter institutions overnight. It seeps into them, exploits their weaknesses, and reshapes them from within. It comes not as a brute force, but as a promise of stability, of greatness, of reclaiming what was lost. It wears the familiar clothes of patriotism and tradition, speaking not in threats, but in reassurances. And while the people applaud, believing they are being protected, the very foundations of their freedom begin to rot. Like ivy growing slowly through the cracks of a long-neglected house, tyranny wraps itself around the structures meant to protect society, until those structures collapse under the weight of something that once looked so harmless. But the poison didn't stay within Italy's borders. Mussolini's playbook, using mass media, stoking grievance, and ruling by personality, proved both simple and seductive. Across the Alps, an obscure German agitator watched and took notes. When Adolf Hitler set about remaking first the Nazi Party and then Germany, he borrowed freely from Mussolini. The march, the myth, the manipulation of democracy until only its form remained. Authoritarians everywhere saw how fragile pluralism could be, how easily frustration could be turned against scapegoats real or imagined. Mussolini shrugged off the notion of rights and replaced them with duties. He painted politics not as compromise, but as battles between heroes and enemies. Around the globe, in Spain, Hungary, later Argentina and beyond, the template was replicated in flavor, if not always in name. This is the third warning. Authoritarianism adapts. It doesn't always stride in on military boots. Sometimes it wears a suit, speaks the language of the people, and uses the very tools of open society to close it down. Yet Mussolini's own hubris proved his undoing. Believing himself destined to reforge the Roman Empire, he led Italy blindly into disastrous wars against Ethiopia, Greece, and finally, as Hitler's junior partner, the Second World War. The cost was catastrophic. Italy was bombed, starved, invaded, and finally reduced to civil war as resistance flared. Mussolini was ousted by his own council, arrested, and then rescued only to preside over a grotesque puppet regime in the north. As the war crumbled around him and Allied forces closed in, Mussolini abandoned his dreams of empire and fled north. Disguised and desperate, he was no longer the roaring Juice of balcony fame, but a hunted man, hollow-eyed, clinging to the last threads of power. Attempting to escape into Switzerland with a convoy of retreating German troops, he was recognized and captured by Italian partisans near the village of Dongo in April 1945. There would be no trial, no grand farewell. Just a day later, Benito Mussolini, once hailed as Italy's savior, once believed by his followers to be untouchable, even immortal, was summarily executed alongside his mistress, Clara Petacci. Their bodies were taken to Milan, where they were strung upside down from a steel beam in a public square. Bloodied, battered, and exposed to the jeers of the very people he once ruled, Mussolini's downfall was complete, not a martyr's death, but a brutal, humiliating reckoning. The man who demanded obedience in life was left to hang in silence, a warning etched in flesh and failure for all who would follow his path.